Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. I am so looking forward to this chat with a very familiar friend. I won't say an old friend, Dr. Larry Steinberg. It's so nice to welcome him back. And we have Dr. Nicole Howard, who will be doing the introductions. I thank all of you that are listening for the gift of your time. This is a little different direction for GPS. And I know some of our regular listeners from the past are backing in to hear this important talk about you and your adult child. So what we want you to know now is that GPS being virtual is for everyone, free, no registration. Please help us spread the word and let others know that everyone is welcome here, near and far. So thank you for that. Before we begin, let me quickly tell you about upcoming programs so we can get right into it. So as we're concluding this year, we still have some good programming we'd like you to listen to. So next week, we'll be welcoming back Dr. Tina Payne Bryson. Her book is called The Power of Showing Up. She'll be talking about raising kids who feel safe, seen, and secure. Dr. Steinberg, probably no different from our relationship with our adult children as well, helping them feel safe, seen, and secure. So listen in for that next Tuesday at noon and 7 p.m. And then the following week, we'll be welcoming back Dr. Robin Silverman. She has a book called How to Talk to Kids About Everything and Make Tough Talks Easier. That's on the 23rd, Tuesday, noon and 7 p.m. And then our final program of the year will be with Judith Warner on May 1st. And then they stop talking to me, Surviving Middle School. So lots to put on the calendar. Very shortly, you'll see a new GPS website with all of the strong programming coming up for next year. So please check it out. Margaret Della Rosa will now do the introductions. Margaret is the president of the school board, the Glenbard Schools, and a tremendous supporter throughout many, many years. So I want to thank her for that and all that you've done to bring us here in almost our 30th year. So Margaret, please take it away.
Thank you, Gilda. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Margaret Della Rosa, and I'm the president of the school board for Glenbard District 87, and honored to be so. Tonight we have Dr. Laurence Steinberg, one of the world's leading experts on adolescence, is a distinguished university professor and Laura H. Carnell Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Temple University. Dr. Steinberg is the author or co-author of approximately 500 articles and essays on development during the teenage years. The author of many books for parents, including The Age of Opportunity, Lessons from the New Science of Adolescence, You and Your Adolescent, The 10 Basic Principles of Good Parenting, and the leading college textbook on adolescent development, Adolescence. His latest book is You and Your Adult Child, How to Grow Together in Challenging Times, our topic today. Dr. Steinberg has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, and is a frequent guest on NPR. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a former president of the Society for Research on Adolescence. And we are honored to welcome him back to GPS today. Dr. Steinberg.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Gilda, for inviting me back. I did an event for you about 10 years ago. So it's been too long between my visits, whether in person or virtual, but I'm very happy to be here this evening. And I want to thank everybody who's tuned in and logged on for coming to this tonight. So I'm a developmental psychologist, and I've been interested over my entire career in how we mature from one period of life into the next, and how a child's transition into a new stage changes family dynamics. At the beginning of my career, I focused on the transition from childhood into adolescence and the challenges parents face during this time. And the last time I spoke in this series, I explained why puberty was starting at an earlier age and the implications of this change for young people's behavior and emotional development. My talk tonight isn't about the beginning of adolescence. Tonight, I'm going to focus on the transition out of adolescence into adulthood. Unlike the passage into adolescence, the end of adolescence isn't biologically defined. The end of adolescence is defined by a series of transitions into new social roles and the achievement of certain milestones that are viewed by society as signs someone's an adult. Things like starting a career, moving into your own place, or getting married. But as with the transition into adolescence, the transition out of adolescence has shifted to a different chronological age. Unlike the transition into adolescence, which begins earlier, completing the passage out of adolescence takes place later these days than in previous times. Today, becoming an adult is delayed and prolonged. And this, it turns out, has important implications for their parents, implications that have not received much attention. So you might have assumed that your work was done soon after your child left adolescence. And if you're like others, you're going to be surprised to find that this isn't the case. This evening, I'd like to explore this with you. More specifically, I want to discuss how parents' relationships with their adult children have changed in recent years, and the consequences of these changes for family life, parents' mental health, and the passage of young people into and through adulthood. This is a new topic for me, but I've thought a lot about it as a professor with young adult students, as a researcher, and as a parent. I have an adult son and daughter-in-law. I learned a lot about adolescence watching my son when he was a teenager, and I've learned a lot about young adulthood watching him during this stage of life. In my books aimed at parents of teenagers, my goal has always been to help parents understand what's important about this stage of development, because knowledge about the phase of life your child is entering can help you be a better parent. And that's why I wrote You and Your Adult Child, to help you better understand young adulthood as a developmental stage so that you can have a better, more satisfying relationship with your adult child. And that's what I hope to accomplish tonight. In my previous book, Age of Opportunity, I discussed how the delayed and prolonged transition into adulthood might be affecting the psychological development of young people. Was their development stunted by staying in school so long, by waiting so long to get married, by putting off the work of becoming an adult to later and later ages? But although I spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about these issues, I didn't stop to consider whether delaying adulthood was also having an impact on the young person's parents. In retrospect, I should have given this some thought. Most parenting books are about the impact that parents have on children, not the reverse. But I knew from my research and my experience as a parent that the reverse is also true. We all are affected by our kids' development. I started graduate school in 1974, which means that I'm now in my 50th year as a scholar of adolescence. And lately, I've been doing a lot of reflecting on my career, which I guess is what people often do at my age. And looking back, I've come to realize how so much of it has been shaped by unanticipated events. Writing a book about what it's like to parent an adult child is something I never expected to do. I wish I could say that it was my brilliant idea, but it wasn't. My agent, Jim Levine, called one afternoon in October of 2021 to ask if I would be interested in writing a book for parents with adult children. Jim had been contacted by Eamon Dolan, the editor I worked with on Age of Opportunity. Eamon had been speaking with someone from AARP, the organization that advocates for people who are 50 and older. Maybe some of you are AARP members. The organization had been hearing from more and more members who were finding that parenting adult children is much harder than they had expected. They wanted help, and they couldn't find any resources. So they reached out to Simon & Schuster, which had previously published several books with AARP. And luckily for me, when they called the publisher, the person who answered the phone was my editor. And as if this isn't a weird enough coincidence on its own, when I worked with Eamon on my last book, he was with a different publisher. So I figured that the fact that AARP had called Simon & Schuster and reached my former editor, who had recently come there from a totally different publisher and have thought of me, surely was some sort of a sign that I needed to do this book. So that's the origin story of You and Your Adult Child. There are a lot of parents with adult children in the United States, by my estimate, about 65 million. Most of these parents are baby boomers, and a lot of their children are millennials. These are two of the largest generations in American history. But also, these are two generations that are very inclined to turn to self-help books when they feel lost. Now, I didn't initially intend my book to be focused on how the protracted transition from adolescence to adulthood was affecting young people's parents. But as I began writing, it became clear that this was going to be a major part of the story that I wanted to tell. And that's the story I'm going to tell you tonight. So I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then I'm going to take questions from you for as long as you'd like to stay. One of the hardest things about writing a book for a popular audience is coming up with a good title. We knew we needed a pithy phrase to describe children in their 20s and 30s, because we wanted a title that would get the attention of parents with kids this age. And after months of discussion, Eamon and I settled on adult child. I didn't want to call them young adults or emerging adults, because we psychologists generally reserve these terms to refer specifically to people during the first part of their 20s, and I was envisioning a wider age range. But adult child has negative connotations. It sounds like it's a reference either to Donald Trump or young Sheldon. But when I use the term adult child, I'm not referring to adults who act like juveniles or children who are obnoxiously precocious. I'm simply referring to sons and daughters in their 20s and 30s. Now, some of the book is aimed at parents of college-age young people, but the book is not mainly about families with kids in their early 20s. It's more about families with kids between 25 and 40. Now, just think about it. We don't have a good label for people this age. They're too old to be called young adults, and they're too young to be middle-aged. But that's who I'm going to be talking about tonight, and about their parents, who are likely to be in their 50s and 60s. So after agreeing to do the book, I tried to review the scientific literature on parents and their adult children, and I discovered that almost nothing had been written on the topic. When people in their 20s and 30s are the focus of psychological research, they tend to be looked at as students, because most of the research is on college undergraduates. Occasionally, young people are studied as spouses or new parents, but we rarely stop and think of them as people who still have active relationships with their own parents. And we don't often think about what it's like to be the parent of an adult child. Now, one exception to the lack of research on parents and young adult children is the surprising number of books I found on estrangement, many of which were written not by scientists, but by bitter or anguished parents whose kids had severed ties with them. Books with titles like Walking on Eggshells, A Son is a Son Until He Gets a Wife, Done with the Crime, and other melodramatic titles that sound like Netflix originals. Some of these books refer to a handful of articles in the popular press that talk about an epidemic of estrangement. They cite studies that estimate that 1/4 of young adults are estranged from one or both of their parents. Could this possibly be true? 1 out of every 4 kids is estranged from their parents? I was skeptical, and it turns out justifiably. Because if you read the original research, you find that this number is very misleading, partly because of the loose way that estrangement is defined. I don't know about you, but I think of estranged children as those who had a long-standing relationship with their parent and then cut their ties to them, stopped seeing them or communicating with them. But this is not how estrangement is defined by most of the researchers who study it, and this is why the estimates are misleadingly inflated. Some of the studies I found include children who are estranged from anyone in their family, including a sibling or a grandparent. Some include children who are estranged from a parent who is dead. And most of the young adults in these studies who say they're estranged from a parent are estranged from someone they never really knew to begin with. Often, this parent is a biological father who had never been in the child's life, typically because they abandoned the family or were left by the child's mother. So the reason in these studies the child is estranged from their father is that their mother is estranged from him too. So if you exclude people who are estranged from a biological parent who didn't raise them, who are estranged from someone in their family other than a parent, or who feel distant from a parent who's no longer alive, the portion of estranged adult children who are estranged from their parents in the way that most of us use the term is less than 10%. So let me correct any misconceptions you may have. I want those of you who have a pretty good relationship with your teenager or adult child that you are not likely to become estranged from them. Now, 10% is not a tiny number, but I would hardly call it an epidemic of estrangement. So it got me wondering, if they're not estranged from their kids, why are all those AARP members clamoring for a book for parents with adult children? Why are so many of them in need of help? Why has this number increased to a point that prompted AARP to be concerned? Has anything changed that's made this stage of family life more difficult than it had been in the past? Yes, absolutely. I think three important things have changed. The transition into adulthood has changed, parents have changed, and the times have changed. And together, these three changes have transformed life for parents and their adult children. Let me start by considering how becoming an adult has changed. In modern society, the transition into adulthood isn't defined by a single event or a particular milestone. We don't have a clear-cut event or ceremony that turns an adolescent into an adult. In our society, the transition to adulthood is incremental. Adolescents become adults gradually, one step at a time. The process has a beginning and it has an end. And therefore, we can measure how long it takes to get from start to finish. You've no doubt seen reports in the press about how it's taking young people longer to become adults. But when I started writing, I wasn't sure whether this is because they're starting the transition later, finishing it later, or both. So I looked at census data to compare the transition of today's youth with that of their parents' generation. To do this calculation, suppose we say that the transition from adolescence to adulthood begins with college graduation and ends with starting a family, with other milestones like launching a career, becoming economically independent, moving into one's own place, and getting married occurring in between. Now, I know that not everyone graduates from college or becomes a parent, and I'm certainly not saying that you need to do these things to qualify as an adult. But using a set of milestones, even if they don't apply equally to everyone, allows us to calculate how, on average, the length of the transition to adulthood has changed across generations, because we can use the same indicators to compare different time periods. Today, it takes young people an average of about 13 years to make the journey from college graduation to parenthood. It took their parents about 8 years. In other words, it takes today's adolescents 50% longer than their parents to complete the same sequence of transitions. Many of the events that usually follow college graduation are being delayed, especially marriage. In 1990, the average age at first marriage in the United States was 23 for women and 25 for men. By 2020, it had risen by 5 years for both sexes. And this, in turn, has led to an increase in the age of parenthood. One of the most striking differences between the generations is in the timing of residential independence. Because of the high cost of housing, the most common living arrangement among Americans in their 20s these days is to live with one or both of their parents. This was never the case at any point in the 20th century, even at the height of the Great Depression. But the cost of housing has risen dramatically, and renting one's own apartment, much less buying a house, is increasingly out of reach for young people. In addition to forcing many young adults to move back home after college, the precarious financial situation they face has had two other important consequences for parents and kids. First, as many of you probably know firsthand, the proportion of young people who depend on their parents for financial support has risen dramatically. And it's not because of COVID. The proportion of 25 and 26-year-olds who relied on their parents for at least half of their financial support tripled between 2000 and 2019, before the pandemic even started. And during the 2 decades that preceded the pandemic, the proportion of 27 and 28-year-olds who relied on their parents for at least half their expenses increased by 50%. Today, nearly 1/3 of millennials receive financial help from their parents. And some of the most common questions I get from parents with adult children concern how to handle finances. In addition to the shortage of affordable housing, many 20-somethings also have problems jumpstarting their careers. When they start job hunting, they encounter educational requirements beyond just having a bachelor's degree, or they discover that the kind of job they had their heart set on is very hard to get. Many have to settle for something that pays less than what they aspired to, or have to return to school or enroll in workshops to pick up additional skills or credentials. So instead of earning money, they've taken on additional expenses. And as a result, they end up living with their parents longer than they or their parents had expected or wanted. The other consequence of the financial strain faced by young people today is reflected in their poor mental health. You've probably heard about the mental health crisis among American teenagers. I don't want to minimize this, but the mental health crisis affecting teenagers pales by comparison with that afflicting young adults. According to a survey released last year by researchers at Harvard, more than 1/3 of people between 18 and 25 suffer from chronic anxiety, and nearly 30% suffer from depression. In both cases, anxiety and depression, the prevalence is double the rate among people between 14 and 17. And this doesn't even count the number of young adults with other problems, like substance abuse, problems controlling aggressive impulses, or disordered eating. Now, I'm glad we're talking about the mental health crisis among teenagers, but I don't think the mental health problems of young adults have received anywhere near the attention that they warrant. Part of this may be because their crisis is harder to see and document. We collect much better and more extensive data on high school students, who are a captive audience, than on their older peers, who are often hard to track down and convince to participate in surveys. My colleagues and I have been studying people between the ages of 10 and 30 for many years, and it takes a tremendous effort to recruit people who are no longer in school into our studies. You're probably familiar with the adage, you're only as happy as your least happy child. So if 1/3 of adult children are anxious or depressed, a lot of their parents must be suffering too. And plus, with more adult children moving back home, parents are more likely to come face to face with their adult child's mental health problems. It was easier for parents to remain in the dark when their kids were no longer living at home, either off at college or out on their own. Many parents, it turns out, are less than overjoyed at the prospect of their adult children moving back home. Decades ago, you'd see articles in the popular press about coping with the loneliness of the empty nest. Well, things have certainly changed. If you flip through the AARP magazine nowadays, you don't see many articles on the devastation of the empty nest. They actually had me write an article for parents on how to get their empty nest back. Not long ago, I did an interview with a reporter about strategies for getting your adult child to move all their junk out of your house. And in case you happen to be having this problem, the trick is making them do it bit by bit, rather than all at once. Moving back home after college changes the adult child's life too. Here's one change that doesn't get a lot of attention in stories about how the housing crisis is affecting young people, but it's one that's worth considering. Ordinarily, the 20s and 30s are the years of greatest sexual activity. I don't mean that the sex is necessarily great, just that you're probably having more of it than at any other age. But things may be changing. According to national surveys, in 2021, 30% of young men and 25% of young women had gone without sex for the entire year. Now, there are all sorts of explanations for this, including social media, which we blame for everything, but more about that later, and online pornography. This may be true, but remember that close to half of people in their 20s are living with their parents, and sleeping in a bedroom down the hall from your mother and father has got to put a bit of a damper on your sex life. And so I wonder whether the increase in adult children living with their parents and its likely impact on people's sexual experimentation has contributed to the postponement of marriage. Because living with your parents after finishing college historically hasn't been the norm in the United States, parents and young people don't know what to make of it or how best to navigate it. They don't know what the rules should be. They may have very different expectations for what their life together will be like. And this can lead to misunderstandings on both sides of the generational divide. When I was recording the audiobook version of You and Your Adult Child, I worked closely with two people in their late 20s. Hearing me narrate the text was their first exposure to the material. And because their job was to monitor the quality of the recording, they had to pay close attention to every word. After the first day, the young woman who was the producer took me aside and said, "My parents have got to read this book. They don't understand me." 2 days later, I heard the same thing from the sound engineer, a young man about the same age. I wrote the book with parents in mind, but I'm hoping that young people will find it informative too. They certainly will find it to be sympathetic, and so will their parents. I did my best to be fair to both generations. In addition to not knowing what the expectations are for living together, families don't know how long this living arrangement will last. And this uncertainty is exacerbated by the fact that in this country, living with your parents after graduating from college still has negative connotations. In many parts of the world, continuing to live with your parents is seen as normal, but that isn't the case here. The Matthew McConaughey movie was called Failure to Launch, not Congratulations on Moving Back In with Mom and Dad. The prolonged transition into adulthood has not only delayed the timing of important social milestones like marriage, financial independence, or establishing a separate residence. It's also shifted some important psychological issues to a later point in development, which has altered their meaning and altered family dynamics. And no issue has been more affected than the adult child's development of autonomy. And I'd like to turn to this issue now. Psychologists point to two periods when clashes over autonomy are common: toddlerhood and early adolescence, the terrible twos and the terrible teens. These are times when individuation is a central issue for the child. It's a time when children try to put some emotional distance between themselves and their parents. And we now know that it's a normal part of growing up. Because of the ways in which times have changed, I think that a third stage of individuation takes place sometime around age 30. But unlike the autonomy struggles of toddlerhood and adolescence, which we often prepare parents for, when your adult child individuates, it's unexpected. You understandably thought that this aspect of your relationship with your child was going to be all settled by the end of adolescence. Well, that may have been the case in past generations. But as I've stressed, the timetable of young adulthood has changed, and so have family dynamics as a result. And that's one of three reasons that relationships between parents and their adult children are not what they used to be. A second force making relationships between parents and adult children especially challenging concerns the expectations of today's parents. They have been intensely involved in their kids' lives from the moment their children were born. They don't need a book because they and their adult child are estranged. It's just the opposite. They need a book because they're so involved. I'm the parent of an adult child, and my wife and I are very close to him, a daughter-in-law, and our 3-year-old grandson. We also have a new baby granddaughter who was born 5 months ago, and I assume that we will be close to her too. As I was writing my book, I couldn't help but think about my own family. And it struck me that you don't have to be estranged to need some guidance and support during a developmental transition that comes as a surprise. Because even in the closest of families, issues arise that are unanticipated, perplexing, and complicated. And I know that this was the case for me. As parents, people of my generation were far closer to our children than our parents were to us. We searched for a preschool like it was a matter of life or death. We oohed and awed at kindergarten art shows, as if we were sipping Chardonnay at a gallery opening on Superior Street. We went to every back-to-school night with a notebook in hand, so that we'd remember all the details of what each teacher had said, and which we'd later review with our child. We screamed from the sidelines at every soccer game, tried to be the cool parents who had meaningful conversations with our kids' high school friends, and were actively involved in the college application process, proofing, and sometimes even writing the application essay. And when our child went off to college, we stayed in touch, multiple times a day in some cases. My undergrads at Temple tell me that they have to turn their cell phones off during exam week because their parents are texting them so often that they can't concentrate on studying. Now, think about the extent to which you were in touch with your parents when you were in college. My contact with my parents during college was limited to an obligatory short phone call on Sunday afternoons from the payphone in my dorm. My parents, who were very good parents, played absolutely no role in my choice of where to go to school. Write my college applications? They never saw my college applications. Though things sure have changed. Professors today tell stories about being contacted by their undergrads' parents to inquire or complain about a grade their child received. My parents hardly knew what classes I was taking, much less the names of my professors. The constant contact between young adults and their parents that we see today is a new phenomenon. Previous generations of parents weren't nearly as close to their kids. Let me give you a personal illustration. When I was in my early 30s, I went through a difficult period with my parents. At the time, we all lived in Southern California. My wife-to-be and I were planning our wedding, and my parents were unhappy with the arrangements we were making, both for the ceremony and the reception. And we discussed the issue endlessly. My wife, who got along very well with my parents, tried to mediate between us, but she wasn't successful. We just couldn't come to an acceptable agreement. And I was especially bothered by my father's behavior because he and I were very close. Well, my mother and father had their displeasure on display at the wedding. At the reception, we barely said a word to each other. Things were so tense and I was so infuriated that my wife and I left the next day for our honeymoon without even saying goodbye to them. After we returned, our communication was awkward and infrequent. Plus, soon after we got back, I accepted a new position at the University of Wisconsin. My wife and I moved halfway across the country, so we didn't see my parents regularly as we had in the past. Things eventually returned to normal, but it took some time. And to be honest, the birth of our son, my parents' first grandchild, 2 years after the wedding. Neither generation wanted things to be strained after he was born. But we had never had an open conversation about what had taken place. One night, during the visit to my parents' house when our son was a few months old, my father and I stayed up for a nightcap. I told him I wanted to talk about our relationship. He looked at me as if I'd said I wanted to talk about space aliens. Relationship? What relationship? I'm your father. Now, it's hard to imagine a parent saying something like that to their child now. My parents were very good parents by the standards of the time. I grew up during the 1950s and 1960s. My father and mother believed that their role in my life was to be there if and when I needed them, but to be hands-off unless something out of the ordinary happened. I don't recall a single conversation in which I disclosed my deepest feelings to them, nor do I remember them ever asking how I felt when someone broke up with me or when I bombed an exam. But I never thought of them as uncaring or detached. It's just the way parents were in those days. Today's parents of young adults are very different. They have a long history of continual hands-on involvement in their children's lives. Parents who've been so intensely involved for so long often expect this level of involvement to continue, even as their kids enter adulthood. Neither generation is sure just what the proper boundaries should be. It's uncharted territory. And that's why all those AARP members have been looking for advice. Neither they nor their adult children know just how to make the transition into this next phase of their relationship. What does it mean to be an involved parent when your kid's in their 20s or 30s? I said earlier that 3 things had changed that transformed relationships between parents and their adult children. So far, I've discussed 2 of them. Young adulthood has changed, and parents have changed. The third contributor to what's going on in families with adult children is our moment in historical time. It's a challenging time for all of us, but the times have taken a harder toll on young people than any other age group. As I mentioned earlier, rates of depression and anxiety among teenagers and young adults have risen dramatically in the last 2 decades, and they were rising before the pandemic erupted. I'm often asked to explain these mental health trends, and what I say is that it's not just one thing, and unlikely to be primarily due to social media. According to well-done scientific studies, social media may be adversely affecting some young teenage girls, but I hardly think that not getting sufficient attention on Instagram is causing people in their mid-20s to feel such despair. There's no shortage of things for young people to feel distressed about: an uncertain economy, climate change, political divisiveness, mass shootings, income inequality, racism and discrimination, student loan debt, threats to women's reproductive autonomy, and the very real possibility that viral epidemics are going to be a part of life as we now know it. Not to mention the weekly reminders in the press that they will never live a life as comfortable as their parents. Honestly, is it any wonder that so many young people are anxious or depressed? In the Harvard study I mentioned earlier, young adult respondents were asked what they thought were the most important contributors to their mental health problems. Financial strain was at the top of the list. Social media barely made the top 20. And it's not just young adults who say this. Social media barely make the top 20 on teenagers' lists either. In their minds, the number 1 contributor to their mental health problems is achievement pressure. Because today's parents of adult children are so close to their kids, so involved in their lives, in such frequent contact, they come face to face with their kids' mental health issues. For many parents with adult children, the challenges of navigating this phase of their relationship are complicated by their kids' depression, chronic anxiety, or substance abuse. The financial context in which today's young people make the transition to adulthood, in which the cost of housing has risen 5 times faster than salaries, has had an especially profound impact on family relationships. This is one of the most common topics I'm asked for advice about. I doubt that there are many parents today who anticipated having to help support their children financially when their kids were in their 30s. But I doubt that many young people expected that they'd be needing their parents' help at this age either. And these violations of expectations can affect the parent-child relationship and both generations' mental health. It can provoke a lot of negative emotions, and most of us are uncomfortable when we have negative feelings about our parents or our kids. I mentioned earlier how autonomy can be a source of strain in your relationship with your adult child. The unexpected nature of the prolonged financial dependence of adult children on their parents has made the adult child's autonomy an especially fraught issue. Adult children and their parents are in a bind caused by the conflict between the child's financial dependence and their desire for emotional independence. In some households, because they feel conflicted about receiving their parents' financial assistance, adult children assert their autonomy in other realms, often rejecting or resisting their parents' advice. It's their way of saying, I still need you to support me financially, but this doesn't mean I'm not capable of managing my own life without your input. I said earlier that establishing autonomy from your parents is an issue that surfaces at various points in development, but the way the issue manifests itself differs across developmental periods. The toddler's quest for individuation is about needing to show their parents and themselves that they're a separate person who has their own opinions about what to wear, what to eat, what to play with, when to go to bed. The teenager's quest is about their need to assert their point of view, to show their parents that they no longer view them as all-knowing or always correct, which is why our teenagers take such pleasure in pointing out their parents' flaws, inconsistencies, and moments of hypocrisy. The adult child's desire for autonomy has a different purpose. It's to prove to their parents and themselves that they're capable of managing the challenges of adulthood on their own. But when they're forced to depend on their parents for financial aid, this is harder to do. It's a lot easier to roll your eyes at parents whose suggestions you would rather not hear if you aren't at the same time asking them to help pay for your cell phone, much less for help with a down payment on a house. The unexpected financial dependence of adult children on their parents isn't easy on parents either. Some wonder whether their financial assistance entitles them to express opinions about how their child is spending the money they're providing. Some feel that they should share the wisdom they've acquired about how to shop for a home or save for the future. Some worry about the impact on their own financial well-being and plans for retirement. Unease about financial issues is not the only thing that parents with adult children struggle with, though. They may not know whether they should speak up or bite their tongue when they see something that concerns them. I'm asked this question a lot, too. They may have mental health needs of their own that arise because of difficulties in the relationship, and this may be particularly difficult for parents who expected that the tough part of parenting was going to be over after their kids were no longer teenagers. In my book, You and Your Adult Child, after discussing why the relationship between parents and adult children has changed and why it's so challenging in today's world, I turn to specific topics that families confront during this stage of life in the realms of mental health, education, finances, romance, and grandparenthood. And I discuss how to tell if your kid is floundering in any of these domains. And perhaps we'll discuss some of these specific issues after I finish my talk. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. But before I wrap up, let me just say a few things about each of these domains and mention some of the most common issues that parents bring to my attention. With regard to mental health, I explained that there's no other period of life when people are more vulnerable to mental health problems than the teens and early 20s. If you look at statistics concerning the average age of onset of a serious mental health problem, you'll see that most problems appear for the first time during this stage of life. This is due to a combination of things. Most mental health problems are the product of the interplay between individual vulnerability and life stress. The vulnerability can be genetic or temperamental, but we now know that at least some of it is developmental, in that the brain is more susceptible to the influence of the environment at some ages than others. And the teens and early 20s comprise a time when the brain is especially malleable, or as neuroscientists call it, plastic. What that means is that the same environmental influence, the same experience, will have a more profound effect on the brain at this age than before or after. And adolescence and young adulthood are times when there's a lot of stress on people, perhaps more so today than in past generations. We can't make the young person's brain less vulnerable, but we can take steps to minimize stress in young people's lives, help them learn how to cope with it, and provide extra emotional support when they need it. In the realm of education, I tell parents that no matter how involved they were in their child's elementary school or secondary school, it's not a good idea to be involved in their college education beyond providing financial assistance when they can. Let your child pick their own major and courses. Rather than intervene when something needs attending to, it's better to encourage them to look for help on campus because it's almost certainly there. College is not just about academics. It's about learning to take responsibility for your own life. And if your parents are stepping in and solving life's problems for you, you're not going to learn how to do this on your own. And know that the large tuition bill you're paying is not just for classes. A lot of it goes toward the multitude of services that colleges and universities provide. So you should encourage your child to seek out and use them. In the realm of finances, I get two questions more often than any others. The first concerns how much financial assistance, if any, parents should provide. Now, of course, how much you can provide depends in part on what you can afford. But the important issue isn't how much you provide, but what you and your child understand the arrangement to be. And before you start providing help, make sure to have a conversation about how much you'll be providing, what it's to be used for, and how long the arrangement will continue. But your child must agree that when they no longer need your help, or no longer need as much of it, they'll let you know. Giving financial help doesn't give you the right to monitor their spending or veto their expenditures. However, if you're providing assistance and you think your child is living extravagantly, it's fine to say something like, "It seems like you don't need as much help from us as you did before. Let's discuss the arrangement and see if it needs tweaking." The other question I get asked a lot concerns establishing rules for living together if your child has moved back home because they can't afford their own place. I can't tell you what these rules should be because every household is different. But what I can say is that before your child moves back home, it's important to have a candid conversation about everyone's expectations to make sure that you're all on the same page. It's important that the young person who's moved back home be integrated into the daily routines of the household, be asked to take on some responsibilities, and not behave or be treated as if they're a long-term guest at an Airbnb. At the same time, it's just as important that you don't revert to the dynamics you had when your child was back in high school. Just because they moved back home doesn't mean they're teenagers again. In the realm of romance, the most frequent question I'm asked is some version of, "Why isn't my kid married yet?" And my answer is usually something like, "Because people don't get married as young these days as they did when you were a young adult." So as a rule, in all aspects of your child's life, it's best to avoid judging them on the basis of the timetable you followed when you were growing up. I also spend some time discussing your relationship with your child's partner. The thrust of my argument is that it's crucial that you do what you can to make this relationship a good one, because if it isn't, it's going to create tension in your relationship with your adult child that, if left unaddressed, may become insurmountable. You don't have to love your child's partner, but you do need to find a way to get along. And finally, I want to say a few words about grandparenthood. One of the most challenging aspects of being a grandparent is knowing what to do when you're not crazy about the way your grandchild is being raised. Should you share your thoughts and advice or bite your tongue? I'm asked this all the time, and to be honest, I asked it of myself soon after our first grandchild was born. I came to the conclusion that it's far better for a grandparent to hold their nose and look the other way than to be a backseat parent. Parenting advice tends to change generationally. Perhaps your child's parenting strikes you as bizarre or misguided, but your child is very likely parenting the way their pediatrician recommended, or how the advice books they use suggests, or how similarly to their friends. They didn't get the advice that you got from your pediatrician 30 years ago, or that you got from reading Dr. Spock, Penelope Leach, or Barry Brazelton. That doesn't mean that the advice you received was bad advice, or is no longer accurate. It's that advice changes. And I can promise you that your grandchildren, after they grow up and have kids of their own, won't parent the same way their parents did. So here's the bottom line. The most important thing you can do as a grandparent is to make your child feel more confident, competent, and comfortable as a parent. That's what's best for your grandchild. Maybe you recall how difficult it is to be a new parent. So go easy on the criticism and instead take time to compliment them on what a great job they're doing. I don't think most grandparents do this as much as they should. So before taking your questions, I'd like to conclude with 5 points of basic advice for parents with adult children. First, accept the fact that parenting never ends. You are going to be an actively engaged parent for longer than you'd expected. Second, resist using the timetable you followed as a young adult to gauge your child's progress toward and through becoming an adult. Stop saying or even thinking, "When I was your age." Yes, you were once their age, but times were very different. Don't mistakenly conclude that your kid is floundering because they aren't following the same timetable that you did. If you must compare their timetable to yours, subtract 5 years from your age that you use for comparison. So if your child is 30, compare their progress to where you were when you were 25. Third, respect your adult child's need for autonomy. Once you appreciate what the underlying issues are, you'll better understand why your child rolls their eyes at your advice, asks you to mind your own business, or actively resists your well-intended suggestions. If you understand that their normal need to individuate from you is the root cause of this, you'll see why you shouldn't take it personally. And when you start to feel hurt or annoyed, remember, it's not about you. Fourth, when trying to decide whether to speak your mind or bite your tongue, follow this general principle. Speak up if your child is about to do something that will have serious, irreparable, harmful consequences. Keep in mind that this is another transitional time in your relationship, and transitional times are always challenging for parents and their children. Relationships are being redefined and realigned, and there will be bumps in the road. But you've encountered these sorts of disruptions before during previous developmental transitions, and you've gotten through them. There is light at the end of this tunnel. As your adult child establishes autonomy from you, the tensions you and they have are likely to wane. You and your adult child will develop an even deeper friendship, maybe even what my dad would have called a relationship. So thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions. And I also want to say that I'm happy to answer emails from any of you if you have questions about your specific circumstances. My email address is lds@temple.edu. And you can find out information about how to reach me on the Temple University website as well. So Gilda, I'll turn it back to you.
Great.
Questions.
Such wonderful advice. You've made us feel better. We're not alone. How to understand what they're going through so we can empathize. And you've given us some good advice for the child who's still in high school now. Get ready. Get ready. Do not do for your child what they can do for themselves. To me, that's the big push, the big conflict about parenting, period. It feels good when we do for our children, and to always resist. Am I right about this?
Yes. I mean, I think that you have to understand what your aim is as a parent. And your aim as a parent, among others, is to make sure that your child can behave responsibly, independently. And they're not going to develop that skill unless you let them make decisions and sometimes make mistakes. And so before you intervene, I think it's important to ask yourself, how will my child be affected, positively and negatively, by my butting in? And sometimes I think you'll realize that it's better to keep your distance on that particular issue, to be there as a source of support when your child needs you, but to not give a lot of unsolicited advice or opinions, especially once your child reaches high school and certainly once they're in college.
Wonderful advice. Margaret, I know you have a question or a comment.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Dr. Steinberg. You really have made my my relationship with my children a little bit more clear. I have 3 adult children, and I think your advice on the timetable is so apropos. I think they are dealing with things that are so different. My kids are like 3 individual, they're like 3 single births because they're very far apart. I grew up in a family of 8 siblings, and we were all one after the other. And so I think we sometimes forget that our siblings are sometimes our surrogate parents. And so we had lots of help along the way. And my kids, yes, they have great relationships with each other, but it hasn't really been until they have become adults. But I really like your advice on the timetable.
Thank you. Thank you. And probably if you, like you describe your own family, if you have adult children who are many years apart from each other, they probably have followed different timetables in their own lives because they grew up at different times. And that's can make all the difference.
So I have a question for you. You're in an elevator. It's a very tall building, and you see an adult child and a parent, and you have this sense that there's something you have to say. You've done all this research, you've written this book, and you've got an elevator ride with this parent. What do you want to say to this parent?
Well, I'm hesitant to give advice to strangers, and I don't know whether they want advice from me. If I can say something to them kind of in a humorous or lighthearted way, I might do something like that. Uh, maybe in some circumstances, I would introduce myself and say that that I specialize in parent-child relationships, and I wonder if they have any questions for me that I can help them with. But I think it takes a very soft touch to be able to do that. You never know how a stranger is going to react to that.
No, you're right. You're right. That's a good point. So when you do this talk, is there one question that comes up most of all about this is the question that everybody has for you? The most popular question.
There are several. One question has to do with um, if you're helping to support your child financially, what should you do if they're spending money on things that you don't think they should be spending money on? Right? I mean, so the situation is that, let's say that you're helping to subsidize your adult child's rent and give them a certain amount each month to go toward that. And then you discover that they're eating out in nice restaurants frequently. Or I tell a story in the book about two adult children who are planning on taking an expensive summer vacation, even though they're getting money from their parents. And how do can you say something? What should you say? And as I said in my talk tonight, I think there are kind ways to say, it looks like you don't need as much support from us as we've been giving you. Can we reevaluate our arrangement? Another thing I'm asked, and when I was on WGN the other morning, I was asked a question about what do you do if you don't like the person your child is romantically involved with? And what I said there, and what I say to parents now is, you need to remember that most people don't marry somebody that they were dating when they were in their early 20s. In surveys that asked people, how old were you when you met the person that you married? Nowadays, it's more like 27 or 28 years old. It's not 21 or 22. So if your 21-year-old is dating somebody you don't care for, I think you can just look the other way and not worry about it. It's very unlikely to end in marriage. If your child is older and it could end in marriage, I think you need to ask yourself why you don't approve of this person. And you need to distinguish between matters of taste, in which case you shouldn't say anything, and situations where you think your child is marrying somebody who's dangerous. Maybe they have an untreated addiction, or they're emotionally or physically abusive, or they have a record of criminal activity, or whatever. Something that you think is going to be a serious issue should they stay together. And I think then you take your child aside and say, I think you need to talk to this person and say that this issue has to be resolved before you're going to go any further in the relationship.
Yeah. You when you cut out a minute ago, you left us with 5 principles, and you kind of cut out a little bit in 4 and 5. You got through to number 3, expect their need for autonomy. Can you please repeat about 4 and 5 if you don't mind?
Sure. So 4 was about if you're deciding whether to speak your mind or bite your tongue, there's a basic principle you should follow, which is speak up if your child is about to do something that will have serious, irreparable, harmful consequences. But unless your child specifically asks for your opinion, you should keep it to yourself. And then my last point was simply to remember that every time you go through a change into a new stage of your child's life, it's a transition in your relationship as well as in your child's life. And there can be bumps in the road at that point in time, and that there's light at the end of this tunnel. And once the autonomy issues are worked through, you will probably find that your child becomes a very close friend of yours, because they no longer need to show you that they're capable of being adults, because now they feel like they are.
Such important information, again, for anyone with a child still in high school, that autonomy issue, so much that we can learn from your words tonight. It was so kind of you to let us put this on our YouTube channel for the parent series. I'm really grateful about that, so we can watch it again and then be reinforced in your wisdom to do the right thing. So thank you so much. Always a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Jerica. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Steinberg. This is where we go hug the kids. So maybe we'll just send them a text and say we love them, right?
Okay. As long as they're not in the middle of exam week.
Right. You're right. Stay away from them that way. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Whenever I hear you talk, I always come away with the feeling that I'm not alone, that we need to sympathize more. You always offer a perspective with the data to go along with why this perspective is what it is. There's so much here. I think you wrote the book for the times for those of us with adult children, and I know I speak for many. We're thankful and we're so grateful to you for that. When you were on WGN the other day, you talked about think in terms of 5 years. I thought that was really helpful. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So I think it's hard for parents to resist the temptation to compare their child's progress to their own timetable. But one way to make that a better comparison is to subtract 5 years from the age that you're using for yourself. So if your child is 35 and you want to ask yourself, how is she doing? Don't compare her to what you were doing when you were 35. Compare her to what you were doing when you were 30. And that'll be a more accurate comparison.
Beautiful. We're going to take some questions now from the chat as I pull them up. Dr. Howard, do you have a question while I'm pulling these up?
Not a question, but a comment. That was excellent. And I feel like you were looking into my life, because I'm experiencing the realm of that right now. I have my oldest is like 34, and I just sent one off to college, and just the balance of even what I could afford when she was a child is very different. What I could afford when my son was a child. And so we often hear he's getting everything. We didn't get any of that, or you never would let us do that, and you let him do these things. So even just the back and forth, the emotional aspect of having, adult children in that range and the comparisons that they make. So, and I find myself, I was writing down your 5 and checking myself on what I'm doing. And I'm probably guilty of a couple of these things, like comparing them, saying, when I was your age, by 34, I had my first house, we were married, we had kids, and my child's not married. And so, yeah, I got to stop doing that. And really, I need to dive deeper into your book too, and get some more hints and suggestions, and be able to pass that on to some of our families as our students, our seniors, and matriculating into the rest of their lives. So thank you.
So let me make an offer to you and to anybody else who's listening. I'm happy to take emails from parents seeking specific advice about their situation. And you can find me on Temple University's website. My email is pretty easy to remember. It's my initials, LDS, kind of like Latter-day Saints, at temple.edu. So I'm happy to respond to any emails that I get from parents looking for some advice or some comfort.
That's so kind. There it is. We put it there in the chat. And in going along with how generous you have always been to us, this is, yes, something that will be available afterwards on our library. But do come back tonight at 7 p.m. and spread the word for those. It's very special to hear it live with you, so I appreciate that. So here's a few of the questions. Should we reach out to our adult children when we see that they're struggling, or do we wait until we're asked before offering help? I think you kind of answered that.
I think it depends on the seriousness of the struggle that you see. And I think there's a difference between saying to your adult child, it seems like you're in a tough situation now, or you don't seem yourself lately. Do you want to talk about what's going on? Rather than to just start giving advice without knowing what the situation is. And I think it's important to remember that you can be of value in helping your child get, a therapist or somebody, a counselor to talk to. But because your child is not a minor anymore, you can't be a part of that therapy unless they want you to be a part of that therapy. And so you may help your child get into counseling if they need it, but you might not find out what they're talking about with their counselor, and that's okay, but that's just the way that it is.
Right. You're reminding me, we often hear about how important it is to just be that empathetic listening ear and then maybe throw in the question, what are you looking for here? Are you looking for advice? Are you looking for an ear?
Yes.
And even more so now, right? So here's a
Right.
question about, do you see the passage out of adolescence remaining delayed as we navigate the future of culture, career, and technology? Will this continue?
Yes. I think it'll continue because the kinds of economic changes that have led to the delay are going to persist, and they may even worsen. I mean, the housing crisis has gotten worse in the last couple of years than it was a little while ago.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of the delay, I think millennials get a lot of bad press. And I think that a lot of the delay has been attributed to their grandiosity or narcissism, and there isn't a lot of evidence to support that. I think that it's being delayed mostly for economic reasons and because it just takes longer to find your financial footing in
Right.
today's world than it did when we were growing up. And I don't
Right.
see any reason that's going to change anytime soon.
One of our final questions, romance. You mentioned this on the WGN interview on Monday about the 20s, and would you make mention of that?
Sure, sure. So I get asked, frequently, what do I do if I don't like the person my child is involved with? And I have different answers depending on the situation. What I said on WGN was, well, if your child is in their early 20s, you probably don't need to do anything, because what we know now is that very few people marry somebody that they started dating at that young age. I mean, when in surveys that ask people, how old were you when you met the person that is now your spouse? The average is about 28 years old. And so if your kid is 22, it's probably not going to lead to marriage. So you might just not say anything. I think if your child is older and you don't like the person that they're dating and you see it as a serious relationship, I think you have to ask yourself why you don't like this person. Is it something about the person that's dangerous? Because then I think you need to speak up. Does the person have a substance abuse addiction or a history of violence, or you feel is abusive physically or emotionally toward your kid? Or doesn't seem to be motivated to find gainful employment, something that's really going to affect your kid's life. If it's just a matter of taste, I really don't think you should say anything. I mean, as I said a few minutes ago, you've got to make that relationship work. I mean,
Right.
and so does your child's spouse. I mean, it's a two-way thing. But if it's not working, it's going to cause big problems in your relationship with your child. And I think most kids put in that situation will side with their spouse, not with their parents. And
Right.
so
Good.
that is all that among the very few people that end up estranged from their parents, that's often the cause.
Good. Well, someone just wrote in that they're having a watch party at 7 p.m. with their friends. So you've left a good mark on us this afternoon, Dr. Steinberg. Always
I
a
look
pleasure.
forward to seeing you again at 7.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Howard. Thank you, Dr.
All
Steinberg.
right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Jerica.
Dr.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
All
Take
right, you
care.
too.
See you soon.